I won't be walking you down the aisle. Your sister feels overshadowed. Exactly 3 days before my wedding, my father Walter's hollow voice echoed through the phone, shredding my last sliver of hope. Immediately, my mother Sylvia's voice hissed viciously in the background. Just walk yourself. Don't be selfish and ruin your sister's feelings. On the other end of the line, my sister Camille smirked with gloating satisfaction, crossing her arms to relish her victory of stripping away the sacred moment of my life. In response to that cruel slap in the face, I didn't shed a single tear. My calloused hand tightened around my service weapon. Click! The sound of a round chambering snapped cold and sharp in the armory. They forced me to walk alone, craving to see me humiliated. But they never expected that when the chapel doors swung open 3 days later, the entire Cross family would freeze in absolute terror. The man linking arms with me as I walked in caused 200 of the most powerful generals and officers in the room to simultaneously snap to their feet and deliver a crisp, unified salute. Before I tell you what happened and who that man was, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel if my story resonates with you. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. When I was 18 years old, clawing through freezing mud in a rainstorm behind my parents' house in Tennessee, I had built that obstacle course myself. Stolen lumber from the neighborhood construction dumpster, dragged it a quarter-mile through the back field, hammered together plywood walls and rope climbs in the acre of red clay where the lawn ended, and nobody in my family ever bothered to look. The heavy rain whipped my mud-caked face as I dragged my body over a 6-foot barrier. My biceps burned, my fingernails splitting against the wet grain of the wood. Blood mixed with rain on my forearms. I trained alone every single morning before school. No coach, no spotter, no audience, because no recruiter was going to hand a cross boy anything when his family's entire strategy was to pour every resource into the golden child. My grandmother, Margaret, had told me something when I was 12. She pressed her calloused hand against my cheek, standing in front of the mantel, where a faded photograph of her late husband in his World War II uniform gathered dust that nobody else in the house bothered to wipe. She said the military doesn't care about your last name, only whether you can pick yourself up when the ground falls out from under you. Nobody else in the family mentioned her after she died. They buried her words along with her casket, but I kept them. I stored them in the same locked compartment where I kept every other thing this family tried to throw away. 10 miles from my mud pit, under the warm golden lights of the Civic Auditorium, Camille hoisted a regional public speaking trophy above her perfectly styled blonde hair. My parents sat in the front row, their hands raw from clapping, their faces glowing with the kind of pride I had never seen directed at me. My mother had bought a new silk dress for the occasion. She had driven 40 minutes across the county to watch Camille speak into a microphone for 6 minutes about leadership and poise. She couldn't walk 40 steps to the backyard to watch me bleed. I understood the economics. Camille was the portfolio investment, polished, photogenic, fluent in the language of fundraisers and cocktail parties and political handshakes. I was the draft my mother kept trying to shred. Every time I entered a room smelling of sweat and iron discipline, my mother's nostrils would flare. She would glance at my father and they would share that silent, rehearsed look that said exactly the same thing every time. Where did we go wrong with this one? My mother was terrified that my roughness, my calloused hands, my refusal to perform the version of masculinity she wanted, would contaminate the delicate social image she had spent decades constructing around the Cross name. I was a stain on her blueprint. The day I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, a violent storm raged across the parade ground. I stood at rigid attention in my soaked dress uniform on the wet tarmac while other families sprinted from their cars with umbrellas and balloons, wrapping their sons and daughters in fierce, sobbing embraces. I watched a father lift his commissioned son off the ground in a bear hug so tight the boy's cap fell off. I watched a mother press her lips to her daughter's forehead and whisper something that made the girl's shoulders shake with happy tears. The rain poured down the brim of my cap. I scanned the parking lot. The space reserved for the Cross family was an empty puddle reflecting the gray sky. My Uncle Dennis stood in the background shadows near the metal bleachers. I caught his silhouette, hands buried in his coat pockets, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his shoulders hunched against the rain. He was a defense analyst. He had connections on every base in the state. He knew I had just shattered the installation's all-time physical fitness record, a record that had stood for 11 years. He read the internal newsletter. He saw my photograph. But Dennis was born with a spine made of wet newspaper and a moral compass that pointed wherever the family wind blew. He stood there 10 yards away, close enough to shout congratulations, and said nothing. I later learned from a base clerk that Dennis had actually arrived early, had watched the entire ceremony from behind the bleachers, had seen the commanding officer pin the gold bar onto my uniform. He saw my hand rise in salute. He saw every other family in that audience surge forward with flowers and cameras and pride. And then he left. He got into his government-issued sedan, drove to the nearest bar off post, and sat alone for 2 hours staring at a beer he barely touched. He told himself he would call me later. He never did. I watched his taillights disappear through the rain. 40 minutes after the ceremony ended, my parents' luxury sedan finally rolled through the puddles. My father stepped out first, carefully adjusting his spotless dress collar, angling his polished Italian shoes around a mud slick with the precision of a man who had spent his entire military career avoiding anything that could dirty his uniform. Retired Colonel Walter Cross, 30 years behind a Pentagon desk pushing procurement paperwork, collecting commendations for meetings attended and memos filed. He stood in front of me, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Not because he was ashamed of missing the ceremony, but because every ribbon on my rain-soaked chest was earned in actual combat in places he had never been brave enough to deploy to. And that fact burned through the fiction of valor he had built around himself like acid through cardboard. He glanced at my uniform, at the water streaming off my shoulders, and produced 2 words. Good job. The same flat, dead voice you would use to acknowledge a gas station attendant handing you a receipt. My mother materialized behind him under an enormous designer umbrella, her cream-colored heels sinking into the soft parade ground, her face twisted in open disgust at the mud streaking my polished dress shoes and the hem of my uniform. She turned to Uncle Dennis, who had crept sheepishly back when he saw the family car arrive, and hissed just loud enough for the rain to almost swallow it. Almost. You're going to get yourself killed for nothing. Why can't you be a little more like Camille? I didn't flinch. My jaw locked and my teeth pressed together until I felt the pressure in my skull. I slowly raised my rigid fingers to my brow and held a perfect, ice-cold salute. Not for them. For myself. Because no one else in that parking lot was going to honor what I had just accomplished. In that exact moment, standing in the rain with my parents already turning their backs and walking toward their warm leather seats, I forged an invisible suit of iron armor. I welded shut every door inside me that had ever been open to their approval. I locked away every ounce of vulnerability and slammed a steel plate over the place where hope used to live. I lowered my hand. I turned on my heel and marched away, my boots punching through the puddles with the steady cadence of a soldier who had just declared a permanent silent war. The rhythm of those boots on wet asphalt bled into a different sound. The sharp click of dress shoes on polished marble years later, as I walked into the most expensive restaurant in the city. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across silk tablecloths. The air was thick with the heavy, cloying smell of expensive buttercream frosting from a 5-tier cake displayed near the entrance. This dinner was supposed to honor my promotion to Special Forces Major. My mother had made the reservation. She had chosen the restaurant. She had selected the date. But when I arrived and read the gold cursive banner stretched above the private dining room, my name was nowhere on it. It read, "Congratulations, Camille and Marshall." My mother had commandeered my promotion dinner and transformed it into my sister's engagement party to Senator Marshall Vance. I sat at the far corner of the long table without a word, cutting my steak with surgical precision, my knife moving in slow, controlled strokes. The blade scraped the porcelain plate in a rhythm that kept my pulse steady. Across from me, Brooke Sterling, Camille's personal PR handler and loyal attack dog, leaned toward a cluster of socialites and mouthed something cruel while glancing at my plain suit jacket. Her painted lip curled upward. She wasn't even trying to mask the contempt. 3 seats down, Uncle Dennis stared at his untouched plate of salmon with the hollow eyes of a man who knew exactly what was happening and had long ago decided that silence was cheaper than integrity. His fork sat motionless beside his knife. He felt me watching. His eyes stayed down. Camille commanded the center of the table like a ringmaster, desperate to hold a collapsing tent together. She kept lifting her left hand, rotating the massive diamond ring under the chandelier light so it threw tiny rainbows across the linen. She needed the gasps, the whispered envy, the validating stares. Without that ring, without Marshall's political surname, without the borrowed infrastructure of the Vance dynasty, Camille was a woman who had never built a single thing with her own hands. She was a billboard advertising a product that didn't exist. Beside her, Senator Marshall Vance sat with the rigid posture of a man enduring a contractual obligation. His cold, sharp gray eyes never lifted from his phone screen. He didn't touch Camille. He didn't glance at her. He didn't acknowledge that she had spoken his name 4 times in the last 10 minutes. He treated her like a depreciating asset on a balance sheet he was preparing to close. I watched Camille's jaw tighten every time she caught his indifference from the corner of her eye. Her laughter grew louder, shriller, more brittle, filling the silence Marshall refused to fill. At the head of the table, 4-star General Harold Whitfield raised his glass of dark red wine. The room fell silent. General Whitfield was not a man you spoke over. His reputation preceded him into rooms he hadn't entered yet. He had commanded combat operations in 3 theaters of war, and his sharp eyes could disassemble a person's character in the time it took to shake their hand. He scanned every face at that table, passed over Camille without a pause, and locked his gaze directly onto mine. He lifted the glass higher. "To those who bleed for our country." The sentence landed on the table like a dropped sword. Every officer present understood who he was toasting, and it wasn't the woman clutching the diamond ring. My mother's reaction was instantaneous. Her hand shot up, waving through the air in a frantic, dismissive flutter. A cracked porcelain smile stretched across her face. "Oh, you flatter him, General. He just handles little errands around the base. Nothing worth mentioning." She let out a high, tinkling laugh and turned to Brooke for reinforcement. Brooke's sycophant grin clicked into position like a loaded magazine. The temperature at that table dropped below freezing. 2 colonels' wives at the far end exchanged a sharp, disgusted glance. A brigadier general sitting 3 seats from me set his fork down, pushed his plate forward, and leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, staring at my mother with barely concealed contempt. Brooke, sensing the shift, started talking louder, desperately filling the air with hollow chatter about Camille's wedding venue options. Nobody listened. General Whitfield narrowed his eyes at my mother. His jaw shifted. A flash of pure, unfiltered disgust crossed his face, and he set his glass down with controlled precision. He didn't correct her. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Every officer at that table held a security clearance that gave them access to my classified service record. They knew about the firefight in Kandahar. They knew I had dragged 3 bleeding, screaming teammates through a collapsing corridor under sustained enemy fire for 600 meters with a piece of shrapnel lodged in my forearm. They knew about the Medal of Valor the Department of Defense had personally authorized. I felt the cold metal of that medal pressing against my thigh through the fabric of my jacket. The velvet box sat in my pocket, heavy and absolute. I had carried it that night, hoping in some dark, starving corner of myself that maybe my mother might see it, might ask about it, might for once acknowledge that her son had done something extraordinary. She never would. I pushed the velvet box deeper into my pocket with my thumb. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. The general watched me. I watched him watching me. And in that silent exchange, 2 soldiers understood exactly who in this room deserved respect and who was borrowing oxygen. The water was cold going down my throat. Cold like the stinging antiseptic that had burned my nostrils 7 years later in a forward operating base field hospital on the far side of the world. The smell of iodine and scorched metal and blood baked into canvas. That was where I met her. Captain Alina Hayes, combat surgeon. Her hands didn't shake. Not during the mortar barrage that collapsed the east wall of the medical tent and buried 2 nurses under sandbags. Not during the 12-hour surgery where she reconnected a private's severed femoral artery by headlamp while the generator was dead and the backup batteries were failing. And not when she sat beside me on an overturned ammo crate at 3 a.m., her surgical gloves still spotted with someone else's blood, pulling shrapnel from my forearm with tweezers while the horizon burned a sick, pulsing orange from the fires across the valley. She didn't make promises. She didn't ask about my childhood. She didn't probe or push or perform concern for an audience. Once, during a rocket attack that sent everyone else flat on the ground, she stayed hunched over a patient's open chest cavity and kept operating. When the dust settled and someone asked her if she was insane, she said she'd already done the math on the shrapnel trajectory and decided the angle was survivable. That was Alina. She calculated risk the way other people calculated tips at restaurants. Quietly, precisely, without drama, she just stitched. And in the silence between each pull of the suture thread, in the steady rhythm of her breathing, I felt something I hadn't felt since my grandmother pressed her palm against my 12-year-old face. Safety. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just shows up and stays. When her tour ended and she invited me to visit her family, I drove 200 miles expecting a manicured officer's estate with a flagpole and a plaque. Instead, I pulled off a county road onto a gravel drive and stopped in front of a small clapboard house surrounded by towering pine trees. The air hit me first. Fresh-cut wood, pine resin, sawdust so thick I could taste it. The porch steps groaned under my boots. In the open garage converted years ago into a woodworking shop stood retired Master Sergeant Sam Hayes, Alina's father, a barrel-chested man in his mid-60s with hands like worn leather gloves covered in scars that mapped 40 years of real service. He killed the table saw blade when he heard my boots on the concrete. He looked up, pushed his safety goggles onto his forehead, and nodded once. No handshake, no performance, no speech, just one soldier recognizing another. Sam Hayes was everything my father pretended to be. Where my father paraded his service photographs in gilded frames across every mantel, polishing a legacy built on paperwork and Pentagon handshakes, Sam kept his commendations in a shoebox under his bed. He never spoke about Vietnam unless someone who had been there asked. His workshop walls held photographs of the men he served beside. Not posed formal portraits, candid shots, guys sharing cigarettes on a fire base, a medic taping a buddy's ankle in the dirt, a crew sleeping in a pile on a helicopter floor, the ones who came home and the ones who stayed buried in foreign soil. There was one photo near the window of a young soldier who couldn't have been older than 19. Sam never told me his name, but I noticed he touched the frame every time he walked past it. I visited several times over the following months. Each time I watched Sam working on something in the shop. His massive scarred hands shaped a solid oak display cabinet with a patience that revealed weeks of planning. He sanded the edges by hand, refusing power tools for the finish work, his calloused fingers reading the grain the way a blind man reads a letter. The wood was beautiful, honey-colored, milled from a tree on his own property. On my fourth visit, the cabinet was finished. When I walked closer, my breath caught in my chest. In the lower right corner, carved deep into the oak with a chisel, Sam had engraved 2 letters. NC. My initials. He had built it for my medals, for the decorations my own family refused to look at. He had spent weeks building a shrine from scratch. I ran my finger across the glass front, flawless. Sam stepped up beside me and reached out. His calloused fingers gently traced the jagged shrapnel scars running up my forearm. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer pity. He didn't ask if it hurt. He recognized it. He had identical scars on his own arms, earned in a jungle on the other side of the world 40 years before I was born. His motive wasn't charity or fatherly performance. It was the fierce, burning need to honor a fellow soldier's sacrifice. He saw a fire inside me that reminded him of the brothers he had lost, and he refused to let anyone smother it. His raspy voice filled the small shop like a brass bell struck once, low and resonant. You protected others. Good. That means today, you fulfilled your duty as a soldier. Something cracked. Deep behind the iron plating I had welded shut on that rainy commissioning day. Behind years of silence and swallowed grief and careful, controlled breathing, a fracture split through the armor. My eyes burned. My jaw clamped so tight my teeth ached. I took one long, shaking breath through my nose and held it for 4 counts. For the first time in my adult life, I stood in the presence of a father's unconditional respect. Not borrowed, not conditional on my silence, not performing for a crowd. Sam handed me what I had been starving for, and he did it in a sawdust-covered garage that smelled like pine resin and honesty. I exhaled. I stood taller. I felt the bones in my spine lengthen. And I understood with absolute clarity that the family I was born into had nothing left to teach me, nothing left to give me, and nothing left to take. That pine-scented warmth stayed with me for months. It was still clinging faintly to my memory when the heavy, suffocating smell of roasted turkey flooded my nostrils the following November at the Vance family's Thanksgiving dinner. The table was a grotesque display of wealth. Silver platters, crystal decanters, enough food to feed a platoon for a week, laid out for 12 people who would eat a quarter of it and throw the rest away. Camille had orchestrated the entire evening like a theatrical production, complete with assigned seating cards, matching napkins, and a professional photographer hovering near the kitchen doorway. I remembered something she had done 2 weeks before this dinner, a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. At a family brunch, she had cornered my father near the coat closet, her manicured finger jabbing into his sternum. Her voice was low and surgical. If you don't limit Nathaniel's presence, the kids won't visit anymore. She was holding her own children hostage, using 5-year-old Grace and 3-year-old Oliver as bargaining chips to keep me exiled from every family gathering. And my father, that tall, broad-shouldered retired colonel who couldn't look his combat-decorated son in the eye, folded like a wet envelope. He bowed his head and agreed. I sat motionless at the far end of the mahogany table, my back against the wall, a tactical habit I had never broken since my first deployment. Every social gathering was a field operation. I scanned. I counted. I cataloged. Marshal Vance sat at the head of the table, his face locked in the same mask of controlled indifference I had cataloged at the engagement dinner. His right index finger tapped the mahogany surface. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The pattern was erratic, staccato, agitated. 11 taps in 10 minutes. The rhythm of a man calculating his exit strategy. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the masseter muscle jumping beneath his ear like a trapped insect. My mother sat across from him, her smile pulled thin as wire, her eyes darting between Marshall and Camille every 6 seconds. She was watching her investment portfolio fluctuate in real time, and the numbers were not good. Brooke sat beside Camille, her phone face down on her lap, her fingers twitching toward it every time the conversation stalled. She kept glancing at me, trying to read my expression, looking for ammunition she could package into a whisper campaign. I gave her nothing. My face was a locked vault. Dennis sat near the middle of the table, drinking his second glass of wine before the main course arrived, his gaze fixed on the space between the salt and pepper shakers, as if it contained the answer to why he had wasted his entire life being a spectator. My father sat 2 seats from Marshall, occasionally launching into some rehearsed anecdote about his Pentagon years. His voice too loud, his gestures too animated. Marshall didn't acknowledge him. Not once. My father was performing for a man who categorized him somewhere between background noise and furniture. Then the grenade landed. 5-year-old Grace perched on a booster seat next to her mother, her small legs swinging beneath the table, her velvet dress slightly crooked and her bow tilting sideways, looked up at Camille with the clear, unguarded eyes that only children possess. She tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is Daddy sleeping in his office lately?" The air left the room. Every fork stopped. Every jaw locked. Brooke Sterling's silver fork slipped from her frozen fingers and clattered against her bone china plate. The sound cracked through the silence like a pistol shot. Brooke's mouth opened and closed twice before she managed to stammer something about late-night legislation, important government deadlines demanding schedules. The lie was so transparently flimsy, it dissolved on contact with oxygen. Marshall slowly raised his head from his plate. He turned his eyes to Camille. And what I saw in that gaze was not anger, not embarrassment. It was the cold, clinical appraisal of a man examining a product that had failed quality control. The same expression a procurement officer gives a vehicle flagged for scrap. His stare held for 3 seconds. Camille's hands found her wine glass. They wrapped around the crystal stem, and they were trembling violently. Red wine wobbled at the rim, threatening to spill. Her knuckles whitened. Her painted smile collapsed. She hated me. She had always hated me. Not because I posed any threat to her social empire. Because I stood on my own scarred feet while she was a parasite slowly losing her grip on a host who was already reaching for the surgical tools to remove her. I lifted my glass of water. I took one slow, deliberate sip. I set the glass down and I allowed myself one small, quiet smirk. The enemy fortress was cracking from the inside, and nobody at that table had the tools to repair it. If you have ever had to sit silently while toxic people tried to destroy your peace, hit the like button right now. Share your own experiences in the comments, because watching their fake reality crumble is just the beginning. Camille's trembling hands gripping that wine glass. That image burned behind my eyes on a Wednesday morning, 3 days before my wedding, as I sat in the cold blue glow of the intelligence operations room on base. The memory fit perfectly over the present because the desperate, shaking woman from Thanksgiving had now gone nuclear. Captain Jordan Ellis sat at the terminal beside me, her fingers hammering her keyboard with the controlled intensity of someone defusing an explosive device one keystroke at a time. She had intercepted an anonymous audio file circulating through social media back channels, local gossip networks, and 2 minor news blogs. She pressed play. Brooke Sterling's shrill, venomous voice filled the sterile room, unmistakable, dripping with theatrical outrage. Nathaniel Cross was disowned by his military family for poor character. He's a stain on the Cross name. Jordan killed the playback and turned to face me. They want to ruin you before the ceremony, she reported, her razor-sharp eyes already mapping the distribution network on her secondary monitor. I sat perfectly still in my chair. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. My breathing didn't change. My face showed nothing. But inside, behind the armor plating, a switch flipped. Not from calm to fear. From defensive to offensive. My spine straightened, my shoulders squared, my eyes narrowed on the waveform displayed on Jordan's screen, and I read it the way I read any threat assessment. Coldly, completely, without mercy. They wanted to turn my wedding into a smear operation. They wanted to flood the gossip channels with enough poison to make my ceremony a humiliation. They picked the wrong target. I leaned forward and gave Jordan 3 precise directives. Preserve the original audio with full metadata and timestamps. Map every node in the distribution chain. Flag every account that amplified or reposted the content. Jordan's jaw tightened with the controlled anger of a woman who took attacks on her people personally. She pulled up a secondary monitor, cross-referenced the audio file's digital fingerprint, and within 8 minutes had identified the burner account used to seed the initial upload. The account was registered to an IP address traced back to a public relations firm. Brooks Firm. I watched the network map bloom across Jordan's screen like a disease spreading through a bloodstream. Each node another person who had chosen to participate in my destruction. Jordan tagged every single one. She nodded once and turned back to her keyboard. Her fingers were already building the case file before I finished my last sentence. I grabbed my field jacket from the back of the chair and walked out of the operations room into the morning air. My armored Jeep sat in the gravel lot, the olive paint dull under the overcast sky. I climbed in, turned the ignition, and drove straight off base toward Sam Hayes's woodworking shop. The scream of the table saw hit me through the closed door. I pulled the handle and stepped inside. Sawdust hung in the warm yellow light like particles frozen in amber. Sam stood at the bench, feeding a plank of cherry wood through the blade, his safety goggles down, his leather apron dusted white from collar to hem. He sensed me before he saw me. The saw died. The silence flooded in. I didn't soften the delivery. I didn't cushion it with qualifiers or apologies or a trembling voice. I stated the facts the way I would write a field report. Clean, sequential, stripped of emotion. My father refused to walk me down the aisle. My mother backed the decision. Camille orchestrated it as punishment for existing without her permission. Brooke Sterling was running a coordinated media smear campaign targeting my military reputation 3 days before the ceremony. I needed a father for Saturday, and mine had been compromised decades ago. Sam pulled his goggles off and set them on the bench. He dusted his palms slowly on his apron. Then he looked at me directly, steadily, with the absolute stillness of a man who had held a defensive position under heavy fire for 9 hours without blinking, without retreating, without breaking. No pity in his eyes, no shock, no sentimental probing. Just bedrock. Whenever you need me, son. 4 words. They carried more weight than every sentence my biological father had spoken to me in 32 years combined. I nodded once. I turned and walked back to my Jeep. The engine roared. In the rearview mirror, Sam was already reaching for his phone, and I knew without being told who he was calling. The old soldiers' network was activating, and my family had no idea what they had triggered. 15 miles away in her sprawling living room, Camille reclined on a cream-colored Italian sofa, swirling expensive red wine in a crystal glass, scrolling through gossip sites with a lazy, satisfied grin on her freshly injected lips. She was certain I was curled up in a dark barracks room, sobbing, broken, humiliated. In his home office, Uncle Dennis sat in front of his laptop, the same smear campaign articles glowing on his screen. His right hand hovered over his phone. He considered calling me. He considered, for the 1,000th time in his life, doing the right thing. His hand dropped to his lap. He closed the laptop. The lifelong coward chose comfort over conscience one more time. None of them understood that Brooks' idiotic audio file was now the central exhibit in a surgically constructed counterintelligence case file. Every time someone shared it, Jordan tracked the node. Every repost was a fingerprint. The bait was set and the trap was already closing. Darkness blanketed the military base on Thursday night. I sat alone in my office, the desk lamp throwing a tight circle of warm light across stacked mission folders. My grandmother's faded photograph, the one I had carried since I was 12, sat tucked into the corner of my desk blotter. A firm knock landed on the door. Not hesitant, not apologetic. Deliberate. I opened it. Ruth Donovan stood in the hallway, 68 years old, widow of a 3-star general. She carried the kind of authority that didn't require a uniform or a rank or a raised voice. It lived in the way she held her shoulders, in the way her steel-gray eyes could silence a room of full colonels without a single word. In her hands she held a yellowed, carefully sealed envelope with edges browned by decades. "Your grandmother, Margaret, asked me to keep this for you," Ruth said softly. She placed the envelope on my desk, turned, and walked back into the hallway without another word. I sat down. The envelope was brittle, the paper almost translucent with age. The seal cracked when I slid my thumb beneath it. Inside, a single sheet of linen stationery folded twice, covered in my grandmother's firm, slanting handwriting. The ink had faded to sepia, but every letter was sharp. I read the entire page. Then I read the last line again. And a third time. "Don't wait for a coward to knight you. Crown yourself." My grandmother, the only person in the Cross bloodline who had ever looked at me and seen a soldier worth fighting for. Dead for 15 years and still hitting harder than anyone alive. I folded the letter with care and slid it into my tactical clutch beside my military identification and the Medal of Valor. 3 weapons for Saturday, 3 pieces of irrefutable proof that I existed on my own terms. Friday night, the rehearsal dinner was held at the base chapel. Simple, warm, stripped of every trace of the pretense that poisoned every cross gathering. The long table was filled with brothers and sisters in arms who had bled beside me in places whose names they would never repeat in public. Elena sat at my left, her steady hand resting on mine under the table. Sam sat at the head, waving his fork to emphasize his point. So the lieutenant yells, "Follow me," and immediately steps into a mud pit up to his neck. We had to fish him out with a tow cable. The entire table gasped between bursts of laughter. Ruth Donovan raised her glass at the far end and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence was the toast. Not a single cross was there. Chaplain Colonel David Reyes, who would officiate the ceremony the next morning, sat near the center of the table. He looked around at the faces of soldiers and their families, at the genuine laughter, and the calloused hands wrapped around glasses. And he leaned over to me. "I've done this for 20 years," he said quietly, "and I have rarely felt this much honest love concentrated in one room." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice in that moment. Their absence was not a wound. It was a verdict. 15 miles away, at the Cross estate, the walls were vibrating with Camille's fury. She paced the living room like a cornered animal, her stiletto heels punching divots into the hardwood floor with every turn. Media outlets had picked up the story that the entire Cross family had been excluded from a high-profile military wedding, and the public optics were catastrophic. Camille screamed at my parents, her finger stabbing at her phone screen, demanding they attend the chapel Saturday morning to salvage the family's crumbling image. In his dim study, my father sat alone behind a closed door. The desk lamp threw long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. In his shaking hand, he held a photograph of me at 10 years old, swimming inside my oversized dress uniform, my small hand raised in a salute I had practiced in the bathroom mirror for an hour. A single tear slid down his weathered cheek. Not love, not grief. Regret, so deep and so delayed it had rotted into self-pity. He knew the truth he could never say out loud. His festering jealousy of my actual combat record, the record that made his desk career look like a clerical error, had cost him his son forever. The study door crashed open. My mother stormed in, her face contorted with surgical fury. Her open palm cracked across his cheekbone. Smack! The sound bounced off the paneled walls. Put away that pathetic trash, Walter. Dry your tears. Camille needs us as a backdrop tomorrow. She hissed, her voice dripping with the exact same venom she had used to control this family for 30 years. Every word was a blade designed to carve away whatever weak sentiment threatened her social strategy. She turned on her heel and marched out, leaving my father pressing the photograph against his stinging face. In the hallway, Uncle Dennis stood in the shadows. His right hand gripped a crystal whiskey glass until his knuckles turned white, the amber liquid shaking inside. He heard every word, the slap, the hissing, the whimpering. He pressed his spine against the wall and squeezed his eyes shut, the sickening disgust for his own bloodline churning in his stomach like acid. Saturday morning. Brilliant sunlight pierced the stained glass windows of the chapel, throwing shards of ruby, amber, and cobalt blue across the stone floor. Over 200 guests filled the polished pews. Generals, colonels, majors, captains, the true military elite in immaculate dress uniforms, their decorations catching the light. Their spouses sat beside them in quiet, dignified composure. This was power, not the kind you buy at a fundraiser or marry into at a country club, the kind you earn in blood and silence and sacrifice. In the very last row, pressed against the back wall like stowaways hiding on a ship they had no right to board, sat the uninvited. My father, his left cheekbone still faintly pink from my mother's slap. My mother, her spine rigid, her brittle smile bolted on like a face plate. Camille, wearing a designer dress that cost more than most enlisted soldiers earn in a month, her eyes scanning the room for cameras. Brooke gripping her phone with both hands, already composing the spin. And Dennis, who sat with his shoulders caved inward, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the wood grain of the pew. They didn't come to bless me. They came to be seen. Camille had spent 40 minutes in the parking lot rehearsing her concerned sister expression in the visor mirror before walking in. My mother had prepared a speech about family unity in case any journalist approached her. They had coordinated their outfits, their talking points, their angles, a full PR operation disguised as maternal love. But this room was not their territory. Every officer in these pews had spent decades reading people under pressure, separating genuine courage from performance, identifying threats disguised as allies. My family was drowning in a room full of people who could spot a fraud at 1,000 yards. The chapel bells tolled deep and resonant. The vibrations shook dust from the oak rafters. The massive doors at the rear swung open, and the morning sunlight poured through the entrance like a wall of white fire. I stepped into the doorway. I marched in wearing my magnificent dress blue uniform. My chest blazed with real combat decorations, each ribbon and each medal a scar turned to steel. My shoulders were square, my chin level, my back straight as a loaded rifle. Beside me walked Master Sergeant Sam Hayes, his own dress uniform pressed to perfection, his bearing absolute, his granite jaw locked with the quiet ferocity of a man who had waited his entire life to walk a son down an aisle, and had finally been given the honor by someone who deserved it. Our boots struck the stone floor in perfect rhythmic cadence. Left, right, left. The sound echoed through the chapel like a war drum. I did not look at the back row. I refused to give them a single glance. They had forfeited that right years ago. I fixed my entire focus, every ounce of love and defiance and hard-won dignity, onto Alina, who stood at the altar in her own dress uniform, her surgeon's hands clasped and steady, her face lit with the kind of pride that doesn't perform for anyone. We reached the altar. Chaplain Colonel David Reyes stepped forward, his deep voice filling the vaulted ceiling. "Who gives this man to be married?" Sam Hayes stepped a half-pace forward. His boots cracked against the stone. His chest expanded with a breath that seemed to fill his entire body. His eyes, scarred and sharp and blazing with 4 decades of battlefield authority, locked onto the congregation. And he roared with the commanding voice of a frontline leader who had never once in his life whispered when the truth needed to be heard. All of us who stand firm in these trenches do. The chapel erupted. From the VIP section, 4-star General Harold Whitfield snapped to his feet, his spine locked rigid, his weathered hand rising to his brow in a sharp, deeply respectful salute directed at Sam and at me. The scrape of his chair on stone triggered a chain reaction. A 3-star general beside him stood. 2 colonels across the aisle rose in unison. An entire row of majors pushed back their chairs. The scraping became a roar. Arms rose, shoulders squared. 200 officers stood at rigid attention, their salutes forming a wall of honor that swept across the chapel like a tidal wave. The sound of synchronized movement, fabric snapping and heels clicking together, filled the space with a thunder that shook the stained glass. I felt it before I saw it. The wave of respect rolling toward me from every direction, pressing against my skin like a physical force. The air changed. It thickened with something I had spent my entire life chasing and never found inside the house where I grew up. Recognition. Not for my name. For my scars. Behind me, somewhere in the last row, I heard a strangled gasp, the scrape of a heel against stone, the sound of someone's knees failing. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Smooth jazz drifted through the reception hall. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across white linen tablecloths. Champagne flutes clinked. On the surface, the space was elegant, celebratory, joyful. Beneath the surface, it was a reckoning ground, and every predator in my family could smell their own blood in the water. My father spotted me standing near the head table, my hand resting on the white cloth beside my untouched champagne. He pushed himself up from his chair with the labored, unsteady effort of a man whose legs had lost the will to support him. He shuffled toward me, each step slower than the last, like a defendant approaching the bench. He stopped 2 feet away. His lips trembled. He opened his mouth and I watched the shape of an apology form and collapse 3 times before he managed to push sound through his throat. I reached into my jacket pocket. My fingers closed around the flash drive, the one containing the complete, unedited recording of Brooke Sterling's smear campaign, preserved by Captain Jordan Ellis with metadata, timestamps, IP traces, and a full distribution log. I pulled it out and placed it on the table. Clack! The small, precise sound of plastic hitting linen cut through the jazz music. Are you apologizing because your conscience hurts, or because General Whitfield saluted your son today? The blood drained from his face so fast his skin turned the color of old paper. His mouth hung open. Nothing came out. He stared at the flash drive like it was a detonator with his name on it. Then he turned and stumbled back toward his chair, his hands grabbing the backs of seats for balance, his polished shoes scuffing the floor with each retreating step. From across the hall, Brooke Sterling watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. Her jaw tightened. She started to rise, her phone already in her hand, her thumb hovering over the camera icon, ready to spin, to retaliate, to launch the next salvo of manufactured outrage. She never got the chance. Captain Jordan Ellis materialized behind Brooke's chair like a shadow detaching from the wall. Jordan leaned down, her lips an inch from Brooke's ear, and delivered each word with the clinical precision of a surgeon cutting sutures. Your audio tape is sitting on an FBI desk. Get out before I have the MPs drag you out. Brooke's face went through 3 colors in 2 seconds. White, gray, a shade I had previously only seen on field casualties. She exploded from her chair so violently that she caught the edge of the table with her hip and sent an entire tray of red wine glasses crashing to the floor. Crystal shattered. Red wine splattered across the white linen like crime scene evidence. She sprinted for the exit, her heels clicking in frantic, off-balance staccato, and she was gone. The double door swung shut behind her, the sound of her panicked retreat fading into the parking lot. The crash whipped every head in the room, including Camille's. She sat frozen at a corner table, her champagne glass hovering an inch from her lips, her knuckles bone white around the crystal stem. She forced a smile as General Harold Whitfield walked slowly past her table. She lifted her glass toward him, a desperate attempt at charm, at connection, at damage control. The general stopped. He turned his head and dropped his gaze onto Camille with the gravitational weight of a man who had commanded the destruction of fortified enemy positions without losing a minute of sleep. His voice carried just far enough for every surrounding table to absorb every syllable. Ms. Cross, my daughter-in-law, you really think your family's power lies in trivial tea parties? No. It lies in the man dancing over there. He tilted his chin toward the center of the dance floor, where Alina and I swayed together under the warm chandelier light. My head rested against her shoulder. Her palm pressed flat against my back. Her heartbeat was steady, the same steady rhythm I had first heard in a field hospital while the world burned outside. We turned slowly, the music wrapping around us. And in that moment, the rest of the room, the shattered glasses, the fleeing PR directors, the collapsing dynasties, all of it dissolved into background static. We had earned this. Every scar, every silence, every night spent stitching each other back together in places where nobody knew our names. The general turned and walked away without waiting for a response. He didn't need one. Camille's champagne glass slipped. The liquid splashed across her designer lap. She scrambled up from her chair, her composure finally, completely, permanently destroyed. She stumbled toward the restroom, slamming through the swinging door, and from behind it came the muffled crash of something porcelain shattering against tile. Then another. A third. Her entire psychological empire, built on manipulation and borrowed power and the systematic destruction of her own brother, had been reduced to rubble. The shockwave hit its final target. At the Cross family table, Uncle Dennis sat rigid, his face crimson, his breathing audible from 10 feet away. 30 years. 30 years of swallowed words. 30 years of watching his nephew get erased, belittled, weaponized, and discarded while he sat on his cowardly hands and chose the path of least resistance. It all erupted at once, a geyser of delayed conscience and rotting guilt. He stood so violently his chair toppled backward and crashed against the floor. He seized his crystal wine glass and hurled it against the wall with the force of 3 decades of suppressed rage. The glass exploded. Red wine streaked down the cream-colored plaster like a wound ripping open. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my mother. His voice cracked through the hall, raw, ragged, and 30 years overdue. You destroyed this entire family." He turned on his heel and stormed out. The double doors swung shut behind him with a heavy final thud. My father remained in his seat, his head bowed, his hands clasped in his lap, a man whose entire public facade had been stripped away in the span of 20 minutes. He didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at anyone. He sat perfectly still, shrinking into himself like a structure collapsing inward after the load-bearing walls have been demolished. My mother sat in the epicenter of the wreckage, her plastered smile finally dissolved, her face naked and exposed under the gaze of 200 people who now saw her exactly as she had always been. A woman who had sacrificed her own son on the altar of social ambition and had nothing left to show for it, except an empty chair where her brother-in-law used to sit and a wine stain spreading down the wall like a public record of her sins. The curtain had fallen and there was nothing behind it. 2 weeks later, the sky was crystal clear, razor blue from horizon to horizon. I stood in my field uniform on the dirt of a massive construction site, surrounded by the skeleton of a new veteran rehabilitation center rising from its concrete foundations. Steel beams were being welded into place above me. Heavy equipment rumbled. Workers shouted instructions across the scaffolding. Something real was being built, and I had helped secure the funding to make it happen. My phone buzzed in my cargo pocket. I pulled it out. The screen read Camille. I pressed the green button one last time, the way you open a door one final time before you weld it shut. Camille's voice poured through the speaker like a siren made of shattered glass. Sobbing, choking, hyperventilating between words. The sentences tumbled out in a fractured, desperate avalanche. Marshall filed for divorce. He leaked everything to the press. I've lost everything, Nathaniel. I have nothing. Marshall Vance, the cold-blooded strategist who had treated his own wife like a renewable lease for years, had finally terminated the contract. He leaked the internal details of their fraudulent marriage to 3 national media outlets simultaneously. Financial records, staged photo ops, transcripts of arguments his staff had secretly recorded, even the details of Brooks' smear campaigns, which Marshall had apparently known about and tolerated until they became a liability to his own brand. Camille's socialite empire, her charity galas, her magazine features, her carefully manufactured public image, all of it was burning in real time. She had lost her host, her status, her identity, and her mind. I listened to her hysterical wailing pour through the speaker. I let it wash over me like wind across a cleared battlefield. No satisfaction, no pity, no gloating. Just the dead calm of a commander standing on secured ground after the last hostile position has been neutralized. Your battlefield, you clean it up. My voice was flat, cold, forged steel laid against stone. I pulled the phone from my ear and ended the call. I held the power button until the screen went black. Then I slid the dead phone into my pocket, picked up my hard hat and walked toward the site foreman. The cord was cut permanently. Back at my office desk on base, a freshly delivered envelope sat on my blotter. Thick, expensive paper. No return address. I opened it and pulled out a long handwritten letter. My father's cramped, unsteady script filled 3 pages. The ink was smeared in spots where tears had fallen onto the paper before it dried. He confessed everything. The jealousy that had eaten him alive for years. The cowardice that kept him chained to my mother's directives. The deep-seated bitterness he felt every time a general praised my name, while his own hollow career faded into irrelevance. He begged for forgiveness. He begged for a chance to start over. He begged. I read the letter once. My eyes tracked every smeared word, every pathetic confession, every plea soaked in self-pity dressed up as remorse. My pulse did not change. My hands did not shake. I reached behind my desk and pressed the power button on the paper shredder. The machine hummed to life, a low mechanical purr. Without flinching, without pausing, I fed his tear-soaked letter into the blades. The machine grabbed the paper and pulled it through, ripping it into thin, fragile ribbons that curled and fell into the bin like confetti at a funeral nobody attended. I looked up. On the corner of my desk sat the framed photograph of Alina, Sam, and me standing in front of Sam's woodworking shop, sawdust on our shoulders, laughing. Beside the frame, propped carefully against the desk lamp, my grandmother Margaret's letter rested in a clear protective sleeve. "Crown yourself." I touched the edge of the frame with my fingertip. Alina, who had stitched me back together on a battlefield and never once asked me to be softer. Sam, who had carved my initials into solid oak because he believed my medals deserved a home even when my own family didn't. Margaret, whose handwriting still carried more authority than any order my father ever issued from behind his desk. These were the people who chose me. Not because blood obligated them, not because social strategy demanded it, but because they looked at a scarred, stubborn, unpolished soldier and decided he was worth standing beside. I stood. I pulled on my field jacket, zipped it to the collar, and walked out of the office into the clear afternoon light. The construction site was alive, hammers ringing on steel, engines growling, the shouts of workers building a place where broken soldiers would come to rebuild themselves, one honest act of respect at a time. I pulled my hard hat on. I stepped off the curb and walked toward the rising structure, my boots hitting the packed dirt in the same steady cadence that had carried me through every fire, every betrayal, every silence, and every storm I had ever survived. If my journey of cutting out toxic family and reclaiming my power gave you strength, please like and subscribe to the channel. I want to hear your stories in the comments. Sometimes justice isn't decided in a courtroom. It's decided by the choices we make. This was Cold Verdict. Because every story has a verdict.